I can't see anything, so I don't know if when you say live, you mean live. We are good. Hello and welcome to Ballarat Get Into Games Expo. My name is Angharjo, and I'm going to be hosting our panel today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we each are today. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I recognise their ongoing connection to the beautiful land and waters that are here. Now, being in Ballarat, for most of you, you would be on the land of the Wadawurrung and Djawardjara Wurrung people. But no matter where you are in Australia, sovereignty was never ceded. It's my pleasure to now introduce Councillor Daniel Maloney, Mayor of Ballarat, to tell us what Get Into Games means to the city of Ballarat.
Good everyone, thanks very much. Thanks very much appreciated. Good morning, welcome to Get Into Games 2021. First, as Rose has done, I'd like to acknowledge here the wonderful traditional custodians of the land, the Wadawurrung and Djawardjara Wurrung peoples, which is where Ballarat is based. I want to pay a huge amount of respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their connection to the land and the waterways. I especially want to extend that respect and love to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So thank you also as well to radio, tech and video journalists from ABC National who will be our wonderful MC today. Guest speakers Alexander Swords, the independent games developer based in Melbourne. Dan Golding, who is also on the line with us today too, a game soundtrack composer and writer and senior media lecturer in communications at Swinburne Uni. And TJ, if I said it right, apologies. Taya, sorry, Taya, I should have got that right. My apologies. Thanks for jumping in then. Who's an independent games artistry designer up in Sydney in fellow COVID land. Get up there. I also want to welcome everyone who's joined us online today. It's fantastic to have you here, especially acknowledging everyone at Ballarat Tech School, Federation University, Highlands, LNEN, industry partners, Creative Vic, Guff Games in Ballarat, and everyone else who's made this event possible. City Ballarat is really stoked to be hosting the Get Into Games annual expo for Ballarat and surrounding schools. We've been doing this now since 2008, and for the first time in 20 years. Funny enough, we're online. I mean, you think this this forum is perfect for being online anyway, so maybe this is forcing us a bit more into the 21st century. In some ways, this Get Into Games event feels probably a bit more appropriate anyway this way. So even though I am missing seeing the huge games console at the Mining Exchange and having all those familiar faces around us as well too. So hopefully we can at least get back to seeing each other again sometime pretty soon. Again, we're pretty excited about what this expo has to offer and also being a part of Melbourne's International Games Weeks program. The gaming and esports industry, I don't think I need to tell anyone who's online right now, it's huge, it's booming. I've got a teenager in my house who's probably spending too much time right now. I need to get him off the computer and into school because it is huge. And while many other sectors are struggling, this is one that is still going strong across the globe. Today, AAA Game Contacts tells me that currently in Australia, let's look at this, sitting on a $3 billion a year industry with predictions struggling that will grow to between 4 and 6 billion by 2024. So that's exponential growth. If you're looking for a career in this space, then this is definitely the place to be. Because getting the Games Expo is a great opportunity to find that getaway or gateway rather into a possible career in this space. Within the gaming industry, it demonstrates the invaluable skills that you're going to need to be part of it. I encourage everyone to be asking questions of our presenters today because these are the experts who have made their way through the industry just as many of the young people online right now hope to do in the years to come. We're surrounded by a pipeline of IT and creative industry skills people here in Ballarat. I'd love to see, as Mayor of Ballarat and as one of our city's leaders, it continue to grow in prominence here in Ballarat. It's great to see that this learning pathway sort of starts at our secondary schools and makes its way through where we're seeing so many talented people go on to Federation Uni, other universities, higher education, TAFE level degrees, and all that without leaving the Ballarat region. And today, we're really lucky to have with us one of the most talented games experts, Dan Golding, who is one of our local talents, and Dan comes from Mount Clear Secondary College. Who knows, Dan's probably able to give you some really especially good local insights. theme for today is create your story. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our guest speakers about how they got into games. I've got a 16-year-old in another room here who's watching in and keen to sort of learn a bit more as well, because this is some great opportunities. So wouldn't we love the future developer from the next Clash of Clans, Tetris, or Minecraft? Actually, are they getting old? I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old. And to see who is able to develop that next wonderful big thing, inspired partly by getting to games. Thank you, everyone. You don't need to hear me talking anymore. Let's hand over to some of the other talented people that we're keen to listen from today. I appreciate everyone tuning in. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Councillor Daniel Maloney. Now, friends, I am so excited for our panel, but none of this would be possible without our wonderful sponsors. So I would like to thank Federation University, Highlands LLEN, Ballarat Tech School, GUF, and City of Ballarat for helping make today happen. It's so good to have you all on board. We have a really, really great lineup of industry leaders. I'm very excited to talk to everyone. And they're going to be telling us all about how they got into the gaming industry. And, I always love these stories because they're as varied and interesting as the people who tell them. It can be really, really daunting to try and figure out what you want to do when you leave school. But I'm sure that whatever it is, first and foremost, you want to enjoy it, right? Because, what's the point if you're not enjoying yourself? When I left school, I stone cold was fully convinced that I was going to be a professional musician and nothing else. And now I'm a television presenter and I get to go around and talk about how cool video games are. It's so good. And I think it's a really great example of how sometimes you might have a really clear idea of what you want, but by just working really hard and doing a bunch of stuff, you can also end up somewhere else that's really cool. Now, as we run through the panel, you can type any questions you have in the chat function, and we'll look to answer them in a Q&A at the end. This presentation will also be recorded and made available on the City of Ballarat and Ballarat Tech School websites after the event, and links will be displayed at the end of the session so you can see that. So now let's meet our panelists. First up, we have Alexander Swords. Alexander is a writer and narrative designer with a background in audience development and arts management. Alex, what does that even mean? How are you developing audiences, managing arts, and writing narratives?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a little bit like what you were talking about with your own story, right? My path was definitely not a straight one into games out of high school, that's for sure. I did finish high school on Ballarat, which is otherwise known as Maryborough, Queensland. So I'm also a country guy. Yeah, I was sure I was going to be a filmmaker. And part of that was, though, because at the time I didn't actually think that I could be a writer in games. I am ancient in games terms. So I grew up with Myst, right? Myst was the game that we all played back then. And it kind of blew my mind on how story could be kind of involved with games. But I was in Australia in a small town. Very lucky, though, that my parents believed in digital skills way back then. So back then that was like a DOS version of Word. And that type of stuff. But it meant that, I was able to kind of move on from that, went into film school and did university. Also, again, in some ways, extremely lucky. My first gig out of university was working on a game, but it was Big Brother. I was in the control room of Big Brother.
What?
And the reason why I got that job was because I interviewed for a runner job, right, which is go get coffees and, take paperwork from one room to another. I got chatting with the production manager about my digital skills, the fact that I could use computers, they had custom software at the time, I had good typing skills, all that type of stuff. So then she gave me a go in the control room, and it kind of went from there. But then reality TV is a thing. So I didn't really want to stay in reality TV. So then I moved to Melbourne and then just started experimenting with the different types of things that I might want to do. Obviously, the film industry here is a lot more, well, at the time was a lot more mature than the games industry back then. So it was mostly a matter of not having too much of a choice, I guess. But I just fell in love with telling stories. And I guess to a certain degree, even though I didn't work in games for a long time, I was always around more live action stuff, more interactive stuff. So I did a lot of interactive, even though I was working in film and television or photography, I was working in an interactive space, most of them around installations and that type of stuff. And then in terms of the audience development stuff, I was really curious about that whole journey of content, right? It's not just a matter of me having my own ideas and then putting them down and then, hoping that someone will engage with them. It was about wanting to really understand what's going on the other end, because I can make stuff for myself and that's cool, and there is value in that, but it's also, I think, much better to also understand what's happening on the other side. In terms of writing and narrative design, though, specifically, there's a kind of a bit of an important distinction there between the two. Writing is obviously an old craft, and it was kind of imported into games to do that stuff that we typically associate with writing, like creating story, doing dialogue, creating characters, all that type of stuff. But for a long time, there was a huge disconnect between gameplay and story. Story was something that kind of happened in cutscenes instead of, during play. And so narrative design came along to actually be an advocate for joining those things together.
Oh, I didn't realize that that's how it was split up. So would you have people that are focused on writing the narrative and those that are focused on designing it, or would those still be done by the same person, I guess?
It really depends on the size of the team. So if you're working for an indie, there's a good chance that you're going to be doing all of that. But if it's a bigger indie or a AAA game, then there are people who kind of specialize in that. In the same way that it's a collaborative medium, right? So you need to know how to work with others, and you need to know how to get these things to kind of integrate. And some people are better at the craft of story, which means they're really good writers, and that's what they should concentrate on. And now we're lucky enough that we have people who are specializing in narrative design as well, where, they love getting meaning out of gameplay that really connects with the story stuff.
So you said that when you started, you were working in film and you didn't really think about games. Was it something that was always I would love to do that, or it just didn't even occur to you as a possibility?
Constantly wanted to do it, but it was a really strange experience for me, because when I saw the games industry grow here, and for a while we started getting some really big studios here doing amazing Batman games and stuff, which was super, super cool. And then about that time, I think I played Borderlands 2, and even though it's a first-person shooter, there's a really kind of deep story there, a really great diverse cast of characters. And just as I was thinking, great, maybe I can do this games thing, the global financial crisis happened and we lost games here for the most part, unfortunately. I was very lucky about that time, though. I have a wonderful, generous mum who lent me some money to go to Berlin.
Thanks, Mum.
Thanks, Mum. Very privileged to do so. I was lucky to be over there because there's a lot of they're going through a bit of a renaissance about story and games over there at the time. So I just happened to be there when they really want writers. I don't think you need to do that now, though. I think with remote working and the tools that we have here, I'm still doing work for the Europeans here from Australia, which is great because the tools have come such a long way. So one thing I definitely want to say is, back when I was in high school, my digital tools were, DOS versions of Word. Now, the digital tools for high school peeps is game engines, right? If you want a career in games, you do game engines. If you want a career in architecture, do a game engine. If you want to be in, design cars, right, you can jump into a game engine. It's the kind of tools that are being used right across the board now. That's really, really exciting. And for me as a storyteller too, right, you have tools like Twine and Ink where you can just pick them up, learn them in an hour, make a game in an afternoon, and that's amazing. I think that's really cool.
What was your very first, what you would call proper job in games? Which is the one that you consider the one that you did that you then looked at and said, man, I work in games?
That was a really fun experience for me because the first game that I worked on was Grand Values Monaco, and unfortunately it never launched. But I feel like my real first time as a writer in games was because that was a bit of a luxury job. It was a well-paid job with good tools and a big team. Unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere, as opposed to the little indie team that I worked with next. And I had to write story in spreadsheets. And I'd heard stories about writers having to do weird and wonderful things to get their stories in games. And so to a certain degree, I felt like that was my first, I work in games. This is a very different environment from film, that's for sure. But that moment really hit me though, when that game All Walls Must Fall was played and I saw people playing it online and seeing their reaction to my writing. And I'm like, okay, this is it. I know this is exactly where I want to be. This is so cool.
And how did you get picked up for that job?
Berlin has a really amazing community, so lots of people are talking, very friendly with each other. So it's I mean, it's one of the things that I like about Melbourne and Victoria and small country towns is, to a certain degree, Berlin just felt like a big country town in terms of people talk to each other and they're friendly and sharing and generous, and also to a degree. They're just grateful that you're there. So, you know, any idea that you want to talk about, they say, yes, let's explore it together. Let's be curious, you know, about what we can do with this. And that's really valuable, I think.
Yeah. And how do you find translating your strong narrative skills into the kind of more technical side of doing narrative for games, which, as we established, it can be quite a different thing. How do you kind of change what you've learned in a traditional sense to work in this new medium?
Yeah, so there's some fundamental differences between the linear mediums like film and television and games. One is obviously the player has agency, so you really need to understand how choice actually works and what people find valuable about choices. The choice needs to be clear. The player needs to understand that they're really making change in the world. All of that is really important to understand, and something very fundamentally different from the film and television writing that I was kind of learning coming through university. Also, too, being able to articulate those ideas in a way that the rest of your team will understand. It's weird that there's still this idea that it's like in film and television, you create a Bible and you have a tome. You go away and you write the tome and you come back and you hand over the tome. In games, no one reads the tome. So, you know, you have to be really good at working out how to actually explain your ideas and to a certain degree sell them to the rest of the team. So, I spend a lot of time in flowchart programs, working out how to actually articulate my ideas. First of all, how to understand them myself, how to understand what's valuable in them, and then being able to actually, talk about those to the rest of the team. Even if you end up being a solo developer at some point, you still need to convey those ideas to your audience, to your players. So I think it's a really important skill to understand, no matter whatever your process is, how to explain that to whoever else you're working with.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexander. Next up is Taya Godson. Taya is a designer, but most importantly, she is a 3D environment artist at Summerfall, which is a development studio in Melbourne. So Taya, when I think art, I will admit, I generally think paintings and things. Did you start there, or did you jump straight into the 3D side of things?
Oh, for sure. I have always been really into drawing and painting and sketching, and that's where I started really creating my own worlds. So I was always really big into creating my own worlds and creatures and these environments that I wanted to explore. And so 3D was really just a natural progression into being able to explore those worlds.
So you've mentioned a lot about exploring worlds. Was that kind of like a key driving desire for you?
Yeah. Is looking for games online as a kid that would let me explore a really cool world. Like, I was really into things like Spyro that had these huge, amazing worlds that rewarded you for exploring them, and you could find secrets and you could find unlockable things that, rewarded you for poking around.
And so how did you make the jump from 2D art into 3D? Because that seems like a big jump to me without knowing how to draw or do 3D very well myself.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, my father was super into computers. Like, he's a programmer, and he set me up with this dinky old computer, and he got me Google SketchUp, which is primarily this architectural and like landscape design 3D program. And I didn't know how to use it very well. It's not very user-friendly. It's pretty difficult to use, but I knew how to make cubes. And so I would just use these cubes and put different like grass textures and brick textures and make these weird dreamlike houses with these long hallways and weird little rooms and swimming pools. And that was really my first foray into 3D, which was really incredible. And so I did that, and I didn't know how to use that program. And then I think when I was in about grade 9, I discovered Blender, it's got a steep learning curve, but it is one of the most flexible and incredible 3D programs I've ever used. It's completely free, which is incredible. And so I just dove headfirst into that and just watched YouTube video after YouTube video, and would take my 2D sketches that I did and try and translate them into 3D.
Does Blender let you make things other than cubes?
It does. It's actually a lot easier. Making a sphere in Google SketchUp is a enormous task, and making a sphere in Blender is a single click.
So you said that you started learning how to use Blender in high school. Did you ever go to uni or any further education and things like that for 3D art, or did you just learn from YouTube like you mentioned?
I just learned from YouTube and from pressing the wrong buttons and then having to Google how to fix my mistakes. But there are some really, really good courses. I haven't done any university training in 3D, but there are some really great game design and game art courses at the moment, which is excellent. But no, I just taught myself, and I started putting all of my stuff online, and I started getting interested in my work. I put it on Reddit, and I put it on Behance, which is a kind of graphic design portfolio website, and people started getting interested.
So how did you turn that online interest into a career in games?
I was actually incredibly lucky in creating my career in games. At the end of grade 12, I started doing concept art for a company up in Sydney that were working on a video game, which was amazing. Like that was a dream come true. Like I would go to PAX and I would look at all the cool games and I would wish that I could do that, and it was kind of a pipe dream. And I got contacted and I made some concept art for a game, and then when I finished that, they said, since you know our game so well now, why don't you come up to Sydney now that you've graduated and come work for us? And so I was completely catapulted into the industry by that. And I worked for them for 3 or 4 months on a short-term contract, and I managed to launch my first game at 18, which was insane.
That's pretty hectic, especially considering that many games don't get launched.
Yeah. So I would say I don't know the stats, but a lot of games that are worked on don't get launched. Like they're all really great learning experiences, and a lot of the time the teams, especially if it's an indie team, a lot of them you can use that work that you do as part of your portfolio, and it's always a really, really great learning experience to learn how to work with people and work with a team and learn new skills. But yeah, tons of games don't get made, which is really, really tough, but it happens.
Okay, so fill me in on the rest of it. We're 18 years old. We've just finished launching our first game. That short contract is finished up. So where do you go to from there? How do you keep that momentum going?
I didn't. It slowed down quite a bit, but that was totally fine. I started studying at uni. I started studying biology, which I love the content, but I'm not an academic. I don't like writing reports. But I was doing a lot of cool graphic design and event design and games 3D modeling contracts on the side. And so I'd get contracted by a team and they'd say, hi, we really need some rocks, or we really need you to make some trees, or we really need this little fence to put in our game. And so that was really great. And I've met a bunch of cool people in Sydney. I did a lot of work for the game Boomerang Foo, which is a lot of fun. So if you see rock walls in that game, I made those rock walls.
I want them to change your strap or whatever now to say Taya Godson, rock expert.
I'm not a rock expert. Rock is so hard. You'd be surprised. But yeah, so I was doing that, and then I did freelance for a while studying, and then I think a couple of years later I got picked up by a company in Melbourne. I got picked up by Mountains, and I moved back down to Melbourne, which is one of the games industry's biggest hubs in Australia for games companies. And I worked out of this building called the Arcade, which is this huge building that houses a bunch of indie studios that have all of their own little offices. And everyone works there together and can get coffee and can talk about different projects that they're working on. And so that was also really lovely to meet a bunch of new people in a new city And yeah, unfortunately, the games that I worked on there didn't come out, but I learned so much. I started learning about all this cool technical stuff, and I started getting really into tech art at that point.
What is tech art?
So, tech art is the side of video game art that. All right, I need to figure out how to explain this in layman's terms without getting too complicated. But tech art is like, once you've made the object, you're basically painting it and I guess kind of telling it what kind of effects to show when the game plays. And so, like, once I've made a chair in 3D, I can then paint it, and then I can say to the game, I want it to look shiny. And that's part of tech art. And I can go, I want it to be shiny here and here, and I want it to look like it's reflecting this, and all of that's kind of involved in tech art. This is a very messy explanation. This is absolutely...
So 3D art is like sculpting the thing, and tech art is painting it?
Kind of, yeah. They're all kind of merged together, but definitely expanding those skills and, learning how to make the object and then paint it and then tell the game how to look at it and how to present it visually. Learning all of those different skills is really, really beneficial for getting a job in games because, the more skills you have, the more valuable you are to a team.
And it also sounds like there's quite a wide breadth of what is done in even kind of one umbrella. Like, you're doing art and there's so many things under that. And then, Alexander was talking about doing narrative, and there's even different parts of writing a narrative. So it sounds like it pays to be quite diverse in what even in your like one little side of the sphere.
Absolutely. So with a lot of indie teams, you don't have the amount of people that allows everyone to specialize in a really small segment of, art or narrative design. You have these AAA studios, and I recently saw someone online was like, this is amazing. I've been wanting this job for my entire life, and it was foliage specialist. And their only job was to make and 3D model shrubs and trees. And
you, the rock expert, can go and be friends with the leaf expert.
I can.
Makes sense. Awesome.
Finally.
Well, thank you so much, Taya. Now, Taya said that she is not an academic, but our next speaker, Dr. Dan Golding, is. And I'm also actually pretty sure that he may be a secret genius because, Dan, you do it all, don't you?
Yeah, I sort of do. I actually have some very quick slides, which I'm just going to bring up. Hold on, here we go. Yeah. So just because it is kind of complicated, it's maybe easiest to explain what I do in diagram form. So I am an academic, as Rad said. My day job is I work at Swinburne Uni, where I teach media studies mostly, but that includes things like teaching film, teaching the media industries, teaching a little bit of games industry studies as well. But I've also done quite a lot of writing outside of the games industry. I've written a couple of books, one on Star Wars as well, one on the games industry. But I've written about games for places like the ABC and Hyper Magazine, which used to exist back in the day and sadly no longer does. So I got a PhD in video games, kind of video games from a kind of media perspective. If anybody's doing media studies in high school or has done media studies in high school, that's the kind of way that I came at looking at games. But then, so it's kind of a convoluted story, but then I ended up doing these things, I guess. So I hosted a show for Triple J and iView called What is Music, which did pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It tried to uncover what music is. I do some video essays on YouTube. I do a podcast about film music. I host a radio show about film music every Monday on ABC Classic. But most importantly, I do games soundtracks these days. Probably the most well-known of which is I made the music for Untitled Goose Game. But I also come from Ballarat, actually. Originally, I went to high school in Ballarat at Mount Clear Secondary, and I grew up living in Buninyong in Eyre Street. So hopefully some of you are familiar with that, and that necessitates this next slide, which is the worst slide I've ever had to put together.
I love it, Dan.
This is me. I think that was me in maybe year 7, maybe year 8, I think, at Mount Clear. And basically this is part of my story, I suppose, because I came to games via music, but it took a really long time to get there. So I did a lot of music in high school. That's me playing trombone in Buninyong at the Gold King Festival, which I think doesn't exist anymore. Some of that hay got into an old amp, like a guitar amp that was on that truck, and created a small fire. So that was a good afternoon. But basically, I finished high school in about 2004. High school for me was really music, actually. I was the kind of kid who, don't tell your teachers, but would definitely just hang out in the music department instead of going to school sports days and stuff like that. Sports was not high on my agenda. And then, finished high school in around 2004, played in a bunch of bands all through uni. But in contrast to what Angarad was saying at the start, where, Rab was saying that she wanted to be a musician, I kind of just wrote off being a musician as impossible. After high school, I was like, that's a thing that'll never happen. So I guess I should pursue traditional academic, pathways and get a quote unquote normal job. That obviously never happened, and music kind of stuck around throughout, and kind of inserted itself at the most surprising times. So this is a photo actually of the day that I became a games composer. I was running a small independent games festival here in Melbourne. Some of you might recognize that's Federation Square. And what we did that day is we put up locally made independent video games on the big screen. I was running this event in Fed Square, and we turned it into like a little, lounge at home. I bought this couch off Gumtree, I think for $40. The people who sold it to me were very excited to learn it was going straight to the middle of Fed Square. Borrowed that rug from a friend and that lamp as well, and played locally made games on the big screen. And this is House, who made Untitled Goose Game. Those 4 people sitting on that couch there. And as you can imagine with this kind of event, there's a lot of kind of hanging around, waiting for things to happen. We were playing their first game, which wasn't yet released, called Push Me Pull You. And I just kind of got to asking them, because it was a work in progress at that point. I was just like, what are you doing about music in the game? Have you thought about this? And the next day I was basically writing music for their game, Push Me Pull You. That came out in 2016. And then when it came time to make Untitled Goose Game, they came back to me. And then, this kind of circuitous route resulted in, the game being written up in the New York Times, which is still kind of mind-boggling to me, and I don't really believe that happened. So that's kind of my pathway through. I'll stop sharing those slides now. And, I have to see those photos of me in high school ever again. But that's sort of what I do, and that's sort of how I got there. Yeah.
Wait. So I might have missed it, but how did you start putting on free play and things like that? How did you get into that side of games before you started doing music in games?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. So all through my study as an undergrad, I was just doing a Bachelor of Arts degree, the generalist humanities thing. I remember going to my high school careers counselor in year 12. He looked at the studies that I was doing, the subjects that I was doing, which is history, English, and was like, yeah, it looks like an arts degree. And I was like, yep, looks degree. That was basically my careers counselling. So all throughout that degree, I was writing about games and doing, writing for like community websites, blogs, that kind of thing. And I decided to turn up to Free Play one day in 2010 when it was running a long time ago, 11 years ago. That makes me feel very old. What a terrible real. And just sort of hung around and, became part of the community, met a lot of game developers, interviewed them, wrote about the event, spoke eventually on a few panels. And then in 2014, they needed a new director, and that became me. So really just sort of being involved, being present, being in the right place at the right time, a lot of that kind of stuff.
And how did you have time between all of that to do all of the other things that you have done as well?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't do it all at once. It looks like I do a lot, and I suppose I do, but it's very rare for me to actually spend a single work week where I'm like, I don't know, running an event, being an academic, writing a book, doing radio, making music. Like on Monday I make music, on Tuesday I do radio. That never happens. Like it sort of comes and goes over the course of, a decade in this case, but definitely over the course of months. But, time management is a thing. And, I think though, that's something that I think is important to highlight, is that as you move into these areas, which are like fun and cool and interesting and exciting, it can be quite difficult to distinguish like work from leisure and life. It all kind of gets rolled into the same parcel. And so I think, it's really, really important to sort of keep that in mind and make sure that you do other stuff, which I've also tried to do. And, it just so happens that often they turn into more jobs and more careers.
You're like, that's how I ended up doing so many things. I was trying to relax and then I turned it into another job.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much, Dan. We've got some Q&A questions that have come through as well. This one, which I'm going to direct to you mostly, Dan, from I=SX. Sorry if this has been mentioned, I missed the start, but I would love to hear about coming to game music from sound design, from a background as a musician/producer.
Yeah, well, look, I think the thing that I would say about that I haven't already said is that I think there's a real kind of feeling that, or an assumption that if you're already a musician, well, the reason why you can't do games music is because you probably need to learn how to code or, do the really technical stuff. And that's not true, not in my experience. There are some people who do that, of course, and that makes you a very different kind of sort of proposition for working at a games company. But, I don't really know how to code. I know how to do website design, like HTML. I can make your font bold like really nicely, but that's kind of about it, really. And so I think don't underestimate the skills that you have as a musician. And I think, working with people who aren't musicians and being able to have that conversation, that kind of creative conversation. Communication is such an important part of this. So yeah, so in terms of beyond that, of course, all the stuff that I sort of already spoke about being, turning up to events, just having those chats with up and coming game makers, those sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. This one, probably both Alexander and Taya, I'll get you to touch on, and Dan as well, if you have anything to add. But Angel Harris, how often are games not launched and how does that impact you? Who wants to go first? I'll throw to Alexander.
Taya, you're muted, love. It's one of those pieces of string kind of thing, because we don't know about all the games that are being made that don't ever launch, unfortunately.
That's a good point.
But the downfall, there's a lot of reasons why a game may not be launched. Not all of them are really terrible. Sometimes I think what happens is teams don't necessarily know why they're making the game in the first place or what they're trying to achieve, and they don't have an end point. And so to a certain degree, a lot of games don't get made because they never reach the endpoint that they never set for themselves. The endpoint usually in that kind of situation just ends up being that a lot of people learned some really, really cool stuff. It ends up, being about the journey more so than the end. But it is kind of a reality too that it does take money to make games, and you need to be able to connect it to an audience to make that money flow. But I guess that's also the same kind of issue. You need to know why you're making the game. If you're making a game for art or for expression, there are plenty of ways of doing it on a small scale which don't require money, and then you can launch it yourself these days, which is really, really cool. But you need to keep your scope in check as well. You need to, if you go too big, obviously, or the bigger you go, the bigger the risks there are.
What about you, Taya?
Games aren't finished all the time. I think, as Alexander was saying as well, you start with an idea and you start with these really cool, designs that you and your friends put together. And then you all learn so much that you're kind of like, well, now we're so much better than what we started with. And now we can make something even cooler. So I think definitely for small teams, that is quite true. But in terms of how it impacts you, I have had to learn the hard way that you can't get too attached, which is really, really difficult. Every game you make, if you have any kind of input on it, it starts to feel like a part of you. And as well as if you start making your own game, it feels, it's such a personal project, because it's not just art, it's not just narrative, it's not just sound, it's this huge culmination. And so if it doesn't get made and you do have to call it off eventually, it feels really bad. And especially if you are working on a team where it's out of your control, that is really difficult. And so it is this really twisty, windy learning process of learning how to put everything you have into a game, but staying removed enough that you can, appreciate the process, but you're not going to be torn to pieces if it doesn't come to fruition.
I think that kind of touches on what Dan was talking about as well, of, with these kinds of creative jobs that are so enjoyable, that people are really passionate about, it can lead itself to a melding of your leisure time and your work time. So what are some things that you can do really to keep them separate and healthy in a way that you still get to use that passion, but it's not going to lead to you being really upset when something doesn't pan out?
Don't turn every hobby into a job.
I like how you say that, and me and Dan have literally just been like, yeah, but then it turns into a job.
That's also exactly what I did. So making 3D art was my hobby, and now I do it as a job. And now I finish my work day and I go, I don't want to do more 3D art.
Yeah, I have to say I haven't run a D&D campaign since I started working in games.
Yeah,
it's too much work. Unfortunately,
yeah,
it's
you have
great.
to write another narrative. I don't think so.
Oh, well, at least we're having fun. Do what you love as a job.
Never work every day of your life.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun though.
Bladed.
I just want to say though, in this kind of business too, and any kind of creative business, right? You're going to hear no far more often than you hear yes, and that's okay, right? It's there's no such thing as an instant success, and no one has a straight path to their success. So whenever you hear no, it's not a no to you. It's just part of life, and you just need to find another way to do it.
Yeah. That's good advice.
I have heard so many people ask me to help them make a viral game. Not how it works.
I literally had one of those last week. I did this thing and it went viral. How do we make it a game?
Yeah, actually, with that, a lot of people, I think of Untitled Goose Game as the game that was engineered to go viral, and nothing could be further from the truth. The House developers, their entire social media plan is basically only tweet when we absolutely can't not tweet. When it would be rude not to tweet, that's the only time we actually tweet, and they barely do anything else on it, any other social media. So the fact that game went incredibly viral is not of their doing. I mean, they made the game, but it wasn't designed to do that. So yeah, definitely agree.
So why was it successful, Dan?
Why was it successful?
Yeah.
What's the ingredient X?
I want Dan to just say it was my music.
Yeah,
It was excellent music.
obviously I was going to say that. No, I think that one of the long-term discussions that I've heard from, because I wasn't in the studio every single day, but I've obviously heard them talk about the game a lot. One of the long-term arguments that I think I've heard they had was what type of paper should be the Goose's list. Like, where the placement of the punch holes and the lines, like what kind of paper that would imply the Goose was using, right? This was a lengthy back and forth about, whether the Goose would use like English, or American, obviously English in this case, but, these kinds of things. And I think actually that tells you so much about the level of attention to detail that went into making that game that a lot of people think is like this funny, kooky success. And it is funny, it is kooky, but there's like an unbelievable amount of craft that went into making basically everything in that game. And I think that's why it was successful.
Attention to detail is so underrated in games, but it is for creating work for your portfolio and for creating a full polished game. Attention to detail is what makes things go further. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's usually where the authenticity is in storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
That attention to detail.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of feeds into our next viewer question from Bladed Nasty Gaming. They ask, what is your thought process that you go through when you're designing something?
Depends on what you're designing.
I feel like it can be extrapolated to anything you design.
Yeah.
A narrative, a piece of 3D art, a piece of music.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm designing something, especially when I'm designing an environment, if it's a full environment and it's with a team, one of my favorite parts is talking with every other person on the team, because at least for me, environment art is a culmination of narrative and storytelling and, the function of the game and all of its aspects. And they're all culminated into basically a pathway that the player is allowed to explore. And so my design process is a whole lot of sketching and talking with everyone on the team, and this really fun process of telling a story with an environment and going into 3D and keeping everyone in the team involved in the design process. And yeah, I wish I had a more static answer for this, but I think every time you design something, it's a little bit different.
How about you, Alexander? How do you go about designing a sweet narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it always comes down to something from my own personal experience. It's funny because a lot of people kind of prize those really big stories, big fantasy sci-fi kind of stuff as something being, something that they reach for. And I think that's why the whole kind of the tome thing, Bible thing kind of comes from. I find that the most difficult way of doing story. It's much easier to go to a personal kind of experience. So I'm working on a game called Totem Teller at the moment. It's quite surreal, and it kind of gets into how story and inspiration kind of works. But fundamentally, it's about exploration, and you do a lot of walking. So the way that I approach that is actually from the way that I enjoy going for long walks, how I pay attention to things while I go for those long walks, and how sometimes I won't even necessarily have a destination on one of those walks, but a narrative just kind of emerges out of that experience anyway. Then I come back and I work in a digital medium, so I jump to a flowchart program, start putting digital sticky notes everywhere of, all the things I responded to, how that journey kind of came about. and then see just how that kind of correlates with the story that I'm writing in Totem Teller. But the key thing there, I think, is always just go back to your own experience when you're doing narrative stuff. Even if you have to dress it up in this, very fantasy or sci-fi, or if you're doing something, which doesn't look like the world around you, there's usually something at the core there from your own experience you can use.
And Dan, do you have any insight into your design process?
Well, with music, I suppose you're sort of working across two different design axes, I guess. Like, yeah, I don't know why I went for that word, but it works. That you're sort of making the music, and you're making the music in a way that you would make any kind of music. You're thinking about texture and tone and melody and harmony and instruments and style and genre and all that kind of stuff. And that's really the world where I spend most of my time in with music. But then you're also thinking about how the music works in the game, and you're thinking about how technically that's going to work. Now, I said before that I don't know how to code, and that's not important, but I do know how music works in games. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about how music works in games. And so you are kind of writing, you're creating something that then has to be technically enabled by a kind of a bit of software, I suppose, which is always a really interesting and totally different task every single time. I mean, Frank Lantz, who runs the games degree at New York University, has said, I never get the quote exactly right, but it's something like making games is like building a bridge out of operas or something like that. And you need the artistic taste and skill and talent that you would need to make an opera, but you also need the engineering and design, skills that you would need to make a bridge that doesn't fall down. So it's kind of those two things constantly combined. And for music, I think which is a creative form that a lot of people are involved in, even from an early age. You play a recorder or ukulele or whatever as a 5-year-old in prep these days. It's sort of constantly combining that very universal, I suppose, creative language to something really quite different. So it's different every single time.
Bladed Nasty Gaming also asks, what is the perfect ratio of story and gameplay? And I feel like I'm going to get very different answers here. I feel like, Alexander, you're going to be fairly strongly in the bucket of saying that story is very important.
It's as important as it needs to be. As long as it's driving the game forward, right? The most important thing is player agency. If story can help them do that, then it should happen. And if not, then it should get the hell out of the way. Like one of my favorite games is Oxenfree. Very big on story, very heavy on story, and it needs to be because it's a story-driven kind of game. But those more sandboxy first-person shooter type ones, you just need a little bit of an excuse to get you out there, immersed in the world and given permission to blow things up. That is also fine, right? I mean, it's definitely a reality as someone who writes story in games that I'm creating other people's dreams. I'm helping them, create that experience, and then helping the player live that experience. I can't be precious about my words. I can't, go, no, player, I will lock you into a cutscene that goes for 15 minutes before you're allowed to trudge across the ground again to your doom. So sometimes it's definitely the case. And also too, I suffer from, there's a myth out there in games that as a writer, the first thing I'm going to do is add a whole lot of story and dialogue and characters to games. I can promise you that with most games who don't have a writer on board, they probably got too much story going on. So I find myself sometimes as an editor rather than a creator for a lot of games.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their experiences and insights with us. We really, really appreciate it. I hope you all feel inspired by our speakers today. And I bet some of you are actually now thinking, you know what? Working in games sounds pretty cool. I wonder if I could do it. Maybe I'd never thought about that before. Well, to help you get thinking about it in some practical terms, we're now going to hear from Janine Bennett, who is the Executive Officer at Highlands LLEN. Janine.
Okay, how am I going? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm pretty proud to be able to present a new resource that is really very much hot off the press. One of our staff members, Kelly Ashmore, has put together a resource over quite a period of time that covers as much as she thought would be of interest to young people around the world of gaming. And what I might do, and hopefully I will manage to do this correctly, is I want to share my screen. And I now need to find, it's called the World of Gaming Resource. And let's see, Albert, you may need to help me here if this is not coming up. Is it coming up, Albert? No. Not yet. Okay, so go into share screen. I might need some help here. It doesn't seem to want to come up. So there it is there. Hang on just a moment. Okay, getting some assistance here. So we'll try again.
Is it working?
No. Okay, I think I might have found it.
Yeah, that's working now. We can see that one.
Working. Okay, so very sorry about that. All right, so this is the front page. The idea of this resource is it's to be viewed online. It's not paper-based because it has clickable links included in it. So as it says here, it is for teachers and also for secondary schools. So let me move through. So it starts with a table of contents, and you can see it's divided into a number of sections. And when you see the little arrow, you know that you can click on it and go to a link. It welcomes everyone to the resource and explains a little bit about it. It has been made specially for Get Into Games. And then it goes into a history of the game development industry across the globe. And then more specifically, it covers the developments that have occurred in various different countries. The next element then looks at the industry in Australia. And if, for example, you can see, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but you can then go to the, and I'm not sure whether you can see this as well, but it takes you to a website. Rightio. Can you still see the resource?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, fine. The next part, again, gives a summary of the industry across the globe, and then it begins to talk about the different elements, I suppose, of gaming. So the first section is on indie gaming, and again, there are an enormous amount of resources or links that the reader can click on. It then talks about AAA gaming. We then begin to look in the resource at how you get into the industry, and it tries to cover all of the different elements as you've just been discussing, because there are so many different opportunities available. The first one is general game development, a number of links there. It then looks at project management, marketing, and also the business management side of the industry. It also has down the bottom left-hand corner, you can see some of the possible pathways of careers that are and options. We then have more links. Story development and acting, as you've been discussing, there's a range of links here to inform anyone that's interested in this element of the industry. Then there's the programming and the technical side of things, and again, a whole list of possible pathways and some more. Then we look at sound design and music composition. Then the artistry side of the industry. As you can see, there's a lot of resources included here. We've even got a section on interpreting and translation. Okay. Another element, of course, of the industry is gaming for educational purposes. So there is some links here too. And then at the end of the resource, there is a glossary. So that is what the resource consists of. It's only about 25 or so pages, but it's rich with content. The resource will be, I think we're sending a link out to people, but it's also located on the Highlands Len website. So if anyone's interested in looking at the resource, you can locate it on that website. So I'm hoping that everyone enjoys it. We would welcome any feedback. So if you have a look at it and if you might find a link that's not working, I hope that's not the case. But if there are any suggestions, we would be more than happy to make changes to this document. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. And I'm not sure whether we're taking questions, but I know I only had 5 minutes, so I'm pretty sure I've covered that so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Janine. As you said, you can go and see that on the gig page for students as well, and it will be shared around with you. So if you are interested in getting into games, which is what this is all about, and we highly encourage it, make sure you go and check that out. But that concludes this part of Get Into Games. There is a ton more stuff happening during the rest of the day, though. There will be 3 workshops on Unreal Engine, Blender, and narrative and composition. If you want to attend one of these but you haven't yet registered, please contact Highlands LLEN or Ballarat Tech School. That contact information will be shown at the end of this session. Make use of that time. Get involved. It's so much fun. Thank you again to our speakers and sponsors for making this event happen. Reminder that you can watch this panel on demand later on the City of Ballarat and Ballarat Tech School websites. Thank you for attending, and we hope to see you at Get Into Games 2022, hopefully in person next time. Bye now.
Are you sure, sir?